Hi everyone, I'm Megan Riley at the Beauregard Parish Library. We're glad that you were able to watch our video today. Funding for Rebirth PL grants has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH, and administered by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, LEH, as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security CARES Act Economic Stabilization Plan. Additional funding has been provided by the Union Pacific Foundation. These grants have allowed us to invite Mr. William Thibodeaux, a railroad scholar, to come and speak about the railroad and blacksmithing and the history and pertaining to DeRitter. So please welcome Mr. William Thibodeaux.
All right, thank you. Let's see, a little bit about myself. I'm retired now after about 44 years with the railroad. First with Southern Pacific Railroad, and then later with Union Pacific once we merged back in 1995, I think it was. And I've been retired about 6-7 years now. So I'm going to be talking about the early railroads, and specifically the railroad that I started off with. And then towards the latter part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about the railroad here in DeRitter. So, early railroads. Steam locomotives were first introduced in America from England in 1830. Back then, there were a few short line railroads in Louisiana, but they were short and weren't all connected together, and probably didn't function that well. And back then, before steam engines, they had horse and mules that would pull the trains, which was much different than what they are today. Anyway, on March 11th, 1851, a group of New Orleans businessmen and representatives from a number of parishes in Louisiana proposed to build 2 rail lines. The plan was to go to the Pacific. That was the plan. And so they were going to build 2 railroads, and both of them were going to originate out of New Orleans. And just to tell you, back then, New Orleans was could have been a center of commerce back during that period. New Orleans was ranked 4th in population, and it was competing with New York for the #1 spot as the largest port city. So that was pretty big back then. One rail line that they were proposing was they were going to go to Nashville with it. The second one was going to Washington, Louisiana, which was at the time a little seaport, a little port city in St. Landry Parish, just north of Opelousas in St. Landry Parish. And back then, to help out the railroads, the Louisiana legislature, they were asked to abolish certain laws and to adopt more favorable laws to help facilitate and promote the immediate construction of the railroads. And the legislature enacted laws that permitted the railroad to expropriate lands if necessary. However, we were fortunate here in Louisiana because most of the people back then wanted a rail line. And back then, if you had your town depended on whether or not you had a railroad. If you had a railroad, you were going to succeed. If you didn't have a railroad, you were going to just die on the vine, basically what it is. Anyway, to help the railroad, former governor Alexandre Mouton, he was one of the main supporters at the time, and he was heavily involved with it. He was from Lafayette, of course, and he wanted to make certain that the railroad did go through Lafayette. That was his #1 priority. And the railroad construction actually predates the U.S. federal government's railroad land grant system, which came into play about 1862 during the war between the states. Anyway, during that period, the federal government allowed 400 feet of right-of-ways to the railroad, and they would give them property, real estate, to sell and do whatever they want with, build depots or whatever they wanted. So it was a pretty good deal for them. And like I mentioned, in southeastern Louisiana, between Algiers and what later became known as Lafayette, landowners donated 100-foot swaths of land for railroad construction. So it was a little bit different than the land grant system. And it was decided at that time that the railroad was going to be built from Algiers across the river from New Orleans. And it was going to be under the direction of chief engineer by the name of George Willard Reed Bailey. And he was a native Louisianian. And at the time, he was assistant state engineer. So we borrowed him, the railroad did, to build the railroad. And he was directed to find the most feasible route for a railroad to go from the Mississippi River to the Sabine River. And they wanted to get to Texas, so Texas and beyond, actually. Albert G. Blanchard, he was a former school teacher, and he was chief engineer in the party that were going to do the survey work and stuff. And also civil engineer Augustus S. Phelps, he was second in command. And their assignment was to find a path for the first section. The first section of the railroad was going to be between Algiers and Berwick's Bay, about 80 miles southwest of New Orleans. Blanchard took the most difficult portion, Algiers to Thibodeaux. And then Phelps was assisted by a Dr. W.S. Smith. Don't know really anything else about him, just that name. And they went from Thibodeaux to Berwick's Bay. So the surveyors made a detailed observation of the proposed route. So it took them a long time. They trekked the swamps, and back then, and it's still that way today, the swamps back then, as you leaving Algiers and you going towards Thibodeaux, Raceland area, it's swampy, and it's what they refer to as trembling prairies or floating prairies. And the earth is actually floating on a crust of earth, and might be 10, 20 feet thick, but it's more or less suspended over water, capable of holding a man's weight, for sure it was. And during that time, prairie reeds and swamp grasses and other vegetation, trees at the time was very thick and approximately 12 feet in height. Sometimes it took an entire day just to get a few miles of surveying work that they needed to do. The engineers recorded type trees that they encountered. It was mainly cypress, tupelo gum, ash, and maple. Those were the trees that were found mostly along there. And they viewed what they call crevasse watermarks. That's like flood stages where they had leaks from the river, Mississippi. And you'd see the watermarks, and what they wanted to do was stay above the watermarks. And they had figured if they could stay 1 foot above the watermarks, they would be in good shape. And the watermarks, when they would see them and document them, they were all 3 to 4 feet above surface. When the engineers came upon the large body of water, say like Bayou Buff, for instance, they recorded it as 19 2/3 miles west of Bayou Lafourche. And Bayou Buff itself, they measured it. It was 590 feet across. Both sides of the banks were 8 feet above the surface of the water, and there was a gentle current each way according to the tide. And then the difference between ordinary high tide and low tide was about 18 inches. And the depth of the Bayou LaBeouf was 15 feet. at low tide. While talking about measurements, railroads were measured in miles and chains. In other words, they had a chain that they would string along, and it was 100-foot length. In other words, a chain is 66 feet long, and there's 80 chains in 1 mile. And the surveyors also examined the soil, the type soil that they would get to. So everything was really detailed quite a bit. For instance, again, at Bayou Buff, the engineers dug between 6 and 12 inches below the surface and reported that the soil was tolerably firm. And the Acadians, early Acadians, they referred to it as terre gras. And you literally, it means fat soil. Anyway, so that was in that area. And it was determined that about half of the entire length between Thibodeaux and Bergs Bay had never flooded before. And the other half was subject to flooding from 1 to 4 feet during extreme high tide or levee breaks off the Mississippi. So let's see, the men estimated that cutting the trees, clearing the roadways for the 25-mile section would cost $9,000. The embankments, grading, were estimated to cost $37,000. Cross ties, $32,000. Spikes, tie plates, and it was small rail that they used back then. I could never find out what size rail. I know whenever I first started with the railroad, some industries and small side tracks and stuff had small rail, like a 63-pound rail, 67-pound rail. Anyway, that might have been the same weight of rail. Regardless, the amount for that was $145,000. An additional $1,200 per mile was estimated for the construction of bridges, culverts, depots, warehouses, and 25-mile, excuse me, in that 25-mile section. 10% was also added to the engineering cost, which brought it up to a total of $244,596, or $9,144 per mile. Many engineers during that era, their opinion was that the best manner to build a railroad across overflowed swamp was to construct a trestle or a bridge. However, the engineers with the railroad felt that it was more substantial and cheaper roadbed that they could obtain by building solid embankment earth. And you can imagine that's in through the swamps, basically, where they started. Their estimated cost for building the embankments were based on constructing it 1 foot above the highest watermarks. Mr. A.G. Blanchard, the lead surveyors, wrote from his personal examinations and information that he had gotten or obtained while he was making the survey. He talked to planners, hunters, fishermen, and travelers, and all agreed that his observation was the best observation. He recommended the route that they were surveying as the most and as the best and the most direct route to the west. And so construction on the rail line began in Algiers on October 8, 1852. And like I mentioned earlier, Algiers is right across from New Orleans, right across the Mississippi River, commonly referred to as the West Bank. Anyway, at the time when they were building the railroad, the distance, the track gauge, the distance between railhead to railhead, they decided it was going to be 5.5 feet, 5 feet 6 inches from railhead to railhead. And at the time, they figured for any subsequent rail lines west of the Mississippi River would follow suit. But they were sadly mistaken, but more about that a little bit later on. With a considerable optimism, the contract called for the completion of the entire railroad line to get to Washington, Louisiana by January 1st, 1855. At that time, Washington, as I mentioned a little bit ago, was a major steamship port in central Louisiana, just north of town of Opelousas. The organizers of the railroad intended to extend the rail line to the 32nd parallel and then turn west to go to Texas. And just to give you a little information, DeRidder is actually on the 30.88 parallel. So almost 31st parallel, but so in other words, the rail line would run just north of DeRidder. That was the plan, and still traveling across, but it would have helped the economy all over the place. And but anyway, so that was then, and anyway, it was a daring undertaking. A good portion of the railroad in the beginning was built on hand-driven piles over snake and alligator-infested swamps. Construction gangs consisted of Irish and German immigrants and were paid $26 a month, and they were paid twice a month. Actually, is what it was. Heat, dirty swamp water, and mosquitoes aided to the discomfort of the men who were actually doing the work in mud and water, and usually up to their waist. 1853, nearly 700 men were employed when the yellow fever epidemic decimated construction crews and put big delays on construction work. And also, about that same time, we had floods. Floods occurred often, and sometimes lasting 6 months or more. Along with that, they had financial problems, which was even a bigger hurdle to overcome. The first railroad's locomotive was lost off of Key West in a storm, and that caused a lot of delays. Originally, it was scheduled to arrive in March of 1853. And costing $6,000. It was a 20-ton wood burner, and it was built by the Baldwin Company. Anyway, since it flipped over and got lost, they ordered another one, and it didn't arrive until September. So that delayed them there also. And upon its arrival, they named it the Opelousas. Of course, the one thing I forgot to mention earlier, the rail line, they decided to name what it was going to be. It was the New Orleans, Opelousas, and Great Western Railroad, or NOONGW. That was the name of the rail line. Construction of the rail line was built by track gangs, and the term is still in use today on railroads, and the same track tools that they used back in the 1850s are the same tools that are used today. And now, I mean, we've got a lot of help now. But anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. But by the end of 1853, the railroad had 8 passenger rail cars, 2 baggage cars, 10 box cars, 25 flat cars, and 10 railroad hand carts, along with enough rail for 215 miles of railroad. So they were off to make a good start. But severe financial problems continued to mess with the railroad. Finances were so bad that the railroad construction gangs were being employed on a month-by-month basis. So that was really bad. The company that was doing one of the major companies that was doing a lot of the construction work was Bates, Benson and Company, and they kept them on for the completion of the railroad through the trembling prairies that I talked about earlier, and basically between Bayou des Allemands and Bayou Lafourche. By February 1856, the entire section was completed from Algiers to Bayou Boeuf, and that's about 76 miles. That was my former territory whenever I worked for the railroad, Southern Pacific back then. Anyway, things were looking fairly good for the railroad. However, the old problem kept resurfacing: insufficient working capital. It just hung on top of them the whole time. Construction costs had far exceeded the original estimates of $9,000 per mile. The actual cost averaged $36,000 per mile is what it ended up costing them. On November 13, 1856, the founders of the railroad reached an agreement with Cornelius Vanderbilt, the steamship service guy. Anyway, they had a steamship service at the terminal at Brazier. Back then it was called Brazier. Today it's called Morrigan City, named after Mr. Charles Morrigan. More about him later. Anyway, what they were doing, the railroad, whenever they opened up the railroad, it was going to run from New Orleans to Morgan City, Brazier, and from there they were going to load them up on ferry boats, and that's where Cornelius Vanderbilt would come in. They would take the cars, the rail cars, and ship them out to Galveston and any other points that they wanted to send them to. But anyway, the company scraped up enough money to again hire the contractors and to commence doing the railroad work up to Berg's Bay. They stopped at Bayou Boeuf first. They ran out of money, and then they finally completed that little section up to Berg's Bay, April 12th of 1857. And what happened, funny thing happened once the railroad was completely built up to Morgan City by Brazier. A lot of people refused to ride because they figured it was too dangerous riding a train over the swamps and trembling prairies. So they figured it was going to sink out of sight. But during that time, besides the railroad, they also built wharfs because at Morgan City it was a seaport town. So they built large wharfs there. They also built large cattle pens. That was because the cattle was going to New Orleans. You know, you always hear about these cattle drives. The first cattle drives went east. They didn't go to Kansas or Texas. They came from Texas to New Orleans. That was the beef capital at the time. Anyway, they were building all these big stock pens, and they even had dormitories for training engine crews. And also they built a house for the station agents. And that was in May of 1857. Also, sidetracks, turntables, and other facilities were also built, including the big shop at Algiers. That big shop was right up underneath the Greater New Orleans Bridge, the original Greater New Orleans Bridge. Elsewhere on the line, depots, platforms, and pumping stations were being built. Every 10 miles or so, water tanks or water towers were built to accommodate steam engines because they don't run on gasoline or diesel, but they do run on steam. Barges were purchased for handling freights across the Mississippi River at Algiers, and there was also a twice-weekly boat train that would match the ship's schedules. And rail passengers would board a ferry at the foot of Ann Street in New Orleans, just several blocks away from Jackson Square. And then once across the Mississippi River, rail passengers disembarked at Algiers. They'd cross the levee and walk one block down to the railroad depot, which was located on the corner of Thayer Avenue and Verrett Street. That's where the depot was located. The process of crossing by ferry boat continued until 1935, until the UEP Long Bridge was built at Westwego, not Westwego, Avondale. In addition to the regular train, daily train from New Orleans, there was stern wheeler connections available, like at Morrigan City, at that area, that would run people to New Iberia and points beyond. And people that would get off, say, at New Iberia would, if they wanted to go to Texas, they would get on the stagecoach at that point and ride going west to Texas. Let's see, for unknown reasons, Vanderbilt sold his steamship lines to Charles Morrigan. And so Morrigan, he was also a steamship man. He had steamships all over the place. And anyway, I don't want to get off the topic, as I sometimes do. Despite the Depression, the railroad was doing good in spite of the Depression of it that took place in 1857. Anyway, I think they call it the scare of 1857. It was a depression, but anyway, business was good on the railroad for the first 3 months. Anyway, no further progress could be made until adequate capital could be obtained at that time. The railroad managed to sell bonds to hire contractors to start grading work west of Burroughs, and again, it was a swampy area, so they had to build a 4-foot embankment across the swamps that was on the west side of the bay. And the grading work started between New Iberia and what became Lafayette, which was called Vermilionville before the end of 1859. So they were doing the grading work going that way, and the prospect was looking pretty good for early completion across the state. Unlike other waterways, the rail line, there wasn't a contract to build a bridge. They built bridges all over the island. In fact, the person I first mentioned earlier, Mr. Bailey, he was really great at building bridges. But as far as this bridge to cross the Atchafalaya at Morgan City, at that time, in the 1800s, they were trying to build a bridge across the Atchafalaya, which was 1,740 feet across and 60 to 80 feet deep. It was impossible back then. It was considered impossible. So again, they employed ferries to carry the rail cars between Morgan City and Berwick. And let's see, the same as what was happening in New Orleans and Algiers. It was a barge with rail tracks on them, and I probably worked on the last. I was probably the last person to work on the wharf years ago. They still had wharfs like at Gretna, and there was an alcohol plant right next door. But I worked on those wharfs, repairing tracks on those. And like all railroads, it needed constant maintenance. However, insufficient drainage coupled with inadequate ballast or rocks made it a chronic problem. In the 1860s, business was good via the railroad and steamship connections, where the railroad hadn't arrived yet. With the helping out with the steamships, so that was a big help. On January 26, 1861, Louisiana seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. So that put a little stop. By the end of the year, track building between Berwick's Bay and what would become Lafayette, at the time it was called Vermilionville, was ready for track building. all of the grading. They didn't have as much swamps as what they had earlier. So they was able to really go across there really quick. And the first batch of cross ties, it was Cypress cross ties back then, were shipped for the 63-mile section. That was between Berwick and what came to be Lafayette. Anyway, they couldn't get the cross ties because the Union forces had blockaded the rivers to where we couldn't get any material. The railroad couldn't get any material, so that was the end of railroad expansion until the duration, until after the duration of the war. And New Orleans fell on April 25th, 1862, and a week later, the NOO and GW was taken over by federal troops. And there's a big story about what took place there, but I'm going to just not go there. I'm going to talk a little bit about after the war was finally over, and the railroad finally got the railroad back. But it was, by the time they got the railroad, it was February 1st, 1866. The war had ended in 65. They finally got it after 4 years, after the Union had taken over the railroad. They finally got it back. And to add insult to injury, the railroad was presented with a bill of $113,773, which for covering all expenses incurred by the federal government during the time they were running the railroad. And the bill was from everything from locomotives to feather dusters that they wanted the railroad to pay for, and they had to pay for that. No maintenance during that time while it was under Union forces. No maintenance was done, and the railroad was in really terrible shape at that time, and it was too much to actually overcome to where they said they decided we're going to just sell it, and they had to buy it. Charles Morrigan, the same guy that bought the steamship lines, he purchased the railroad. He became a railroad man, and a very good railroad man. So on March 25th, 1869, Charles Morrigan purchased the railroad at auction. And he bought all of the property, even west of Berwick's Bay, for a total of $2.3 million. That was the price, and that was in 1869. Now, the Louisiana legislature, they had approved $6 million for its construction. So they bought it at a pretty good deal, I would imagine. So, as they say, the romantic sounding NOO and GW had ceased to exist. Then it became Morrigan's Louisiana and Texas Railroad, because that was his plan too. He wanted to go west all the way to the Pacific. And on July 1872, Charles Morrigan changed the track gauge. Remember earlier I told you 5 foot 6 inches they narrowed it to 4 foot 8 1/2 inches. And that became the standard throughout all railroads in America and many other countries also. However, just to mention, wider would certainly make it better. You would have a better ride. You'd have a better surface base on the railroad. But at the time, they decided they weren't going to do that. And everything dates back to the chariots of long ago. And that was the distance of the axle on those chariots. So, or the width of 2 horses running. So anyway, the town of Brazier was renamed Morgan City in Mr. Charles Morgan's honor. He never lived there, but he did a lot for Morgan City. He dredged the Atchafalaya River, deep into the waterway to where larger ships could come in. And unfortunately, Charles Morgan died. He was 83 years old at the time, and very vigorous man, did a lot of work. Anyway, died at 83 years of age on May 8, 1878. And he had a son-in-law, I forget his name, that more or less took over. And actually, his last name was Whitney. And he married one of Charles Morgan's daughters. And the bad thing about it, Mr. Whitney died a short time later. And so Morrigan's daughter, Whitney, in New Orleans, she was one of the richest women in the South. And you've heard of Whitney Bank? Well, that was Charles Morrigan's daughter. Anyway, I didn't want to get off, but I like little nuggets of history. I like to put that in there. Anyway, the following year, May 17, 1879, the Louisiana Western Railroad signed a charter to begin construction from Lafayette to the Sabine River. And as required by their agreement, the railroad followed alongside the old Spanish Trail. And that was another reason why they came the route that they did, is because there was people used to walk that way with horses and wagons and whatnot. So instead of trying to invent a new mousetrap, they built their railroad right alongside, just like the highways built their highways right alongside the railroads in most places. So most of the land on the proposed rail line was unimproved and uninhabitable at that time, and that's between Lafayette and the Sabine. The first trains that went east reached Lafayette March 1880. That's whenever the railroad finally arrived at Lafayette. It hadn't made it yet to Opelousas and Washington, but it got there. So you're looking at from the first start until then, that was 29 years. That's how long it took. So work on the railroad towards Opelousas and Cheneyville, that continued simultaneously while the rail line was building westward from Lafayette. The arrival of the railroad created multiple jobs that had never existed before. The railroad hired locals to help with the grading work, prepared road beds and right-of-ways, and which were usually 50 feet wide from the center line of track. Some of the newly hired helped build embankments. Others became bridge tenders. They worked on bridge gangs, building depots, office buildings, and bridges, and over the numerous bayous and waterways that we have. The bridge gangs also built culverts at intervals in order to drain water. Poor drainage equates to poor track structure. So they had hired hundreds of trackmen, often referred to as Gandy dancers. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but Gandy dancers, and that's a term that goes way back. And Gandy dancers use picks and shovels and wheelbarrows to work, horses to help dig ditches, and either side of the track, they had drainage on both sides of the track, so they used horses to pull these big sleds to grade them and haul away dirt and stuff and build up the right-of-way. Gandy dancers also spike rails on evenly spaced hand-hewed wooden cross ties. August 28, 1880 was the date of the first through train from New Orleans to Houston. And in 1880, Louisiana had nearly 700 miles of railroad at that time. 1883, the second Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and the NOO and GW was part of that. Probably 12 or 14 different railroads make up the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad shortened cross-country journeys. It would usually take 6 months to get across. Once the railroads were open and established, 1 week. So that was really, truly a quantum leap in transportation at that time. In 1915, at the height of the rail industry in Louisiana, we had nearly 7,000 miles of railroad. In the early 1900s, Southern Pacific Railroad owned a rail line that came to DeRidder. And it was named the Lake Charles and Northern Railroad Company. And I remember a number of railroad workers that worked here in DeRidder, and some that worked on the railroad itself, train and enginemen. Mr. Lloyd Hebert, he's passed away. He's from Lafayette. He was an agent here at DeRidder. Also, Miss Molly Lalonde, she was also an agent here. I knew her, Miss Molly, really well. Also, Curly Whittington was another agent here. A trainman, A.C. Miller. A lot of people call him Spark Plug. A lot of people's got nicknames with the railroads. Anyway, A.C. Miller was conductor on, back then they had a couple of trains that, two daily trains. They were passenger trains that would come to DeRidder from Lake Charles. Two of them running daily. There was a Roy Cormier. I remember Roy also worked for the railroad. There were several brakeman's jobs too, including W.P. George, I.P. Peltier, Harry Hernandez, engineer Gene Spiller, and fireman Mr. Jefferson were originally from the DeRidder area at the time. And at the time, both of those guys, according to my good friend and fellow co-worker, also retired off the SP and UP, Carol Morrow, J.C. Morrow, he worked a branch line, and he said Mr. Spiller and Jefferson both were regular fixtures here in DeRidder, and they were old head trainmen, and they could not be bumped, by Southern Pacific employees at that time. And whenever they did away with when they abandoned the branch line, both of them transferred to Southern Pacific. They went to work for Southern Pacific at that time. There was also a Mr. Wagisback that also worked here at DeRidder. In fact, he was the last one here whenever the line was abandoned. He was the last agent here. And like I mentioned to you earlier, we had one person that actually lived here in DeRidder that went to work for Southern Pacific Railroad back when I was working as a young trackman. His name was C.C. Ryder. I'm not sure what his first name is or initials or whatever, but I know he was from here. After the merger between Southern Pacific and Union Pacific, I worked for the railroad between, that was one of my subdivisions. I worked on the railroad between DeQuincy and Baton Rouge, and among other subdivisions. And each time I would cross the railroad at Fulton, because I knew Fulton was where the DeRidder branch crossed. And I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but I did work on the DeRidder branch a couple of times, but up closer towards Lake Charles area. Anyway, according to 1935 Southern Pacific timetable, indicated 2 passenger trains and 1 mixed train that would service DeRidder, what they call the DeRidder subdivision at the time. And just a little bit of information historically on the Southern Pacific system. Branch lines, that's on the main track, and also branch lines. All the railroad, depending on, regardless of what physical direction you were headed, everything on the railroad was east and west because it New Orleans to California. So along with that, odd number trains went west. Sorry, that's not right. Odd number trains, odd number trains went west, even number trains went east. And also, just to mention, milepost numbers, as you're going west, milepost numbers increase. So as an example, Lake Charles was milepost 0, DeRidder was milepost 45.3. And let's see, that was according to timetable 2. And the timetable is basically a roadmap of the area where you are, because it on the main track, branches, and subdivisions, they will list all of the stations that you come across, and it also give you the distance in miles to the next location. Let's see. Also on Southern Pacific at the time, eastward trains were superior to trains of the same class but gone in the opposite direction. Let's see. Let's see here. Here's a few stations, and I would imagine they were probably all flag stops. These are stations that went from Lake Charles. Once you left Lake Charles, the first station was Ararat, Gillis, Gaytine, Fulton, Longville, Bannister, Bonami, and DeRidder. Those were the stations. And like I said, I'm sure they were probably mostly all flag stops except here at DeRidder and Lake Charles. In other words, what that means is the train would stop for you if they would see you. A lot of times people that stand up close to the track and wave at the engineer, and the train would stop and pick you up. Anyway, sometimes in the 1980s, there was a big push to take up all of the abandoned rail lines. For instance, DeRidder was one of those branch lines that was taken up. And then I'll tell you some other ones that were taken up too, not only at DeRidder. Lake Arthur branch, Alexandria branch, Breaux Bridge, Baton Rouge, St. Martinville, the FNA, which is the Franklin-Abbeville line. Of course, people would say it stood for frogs and alligators, but it was actually Franklin and Abbeville. The Midland branch was another line taken up, Avery Island, Houma, Thibodeaux, Lockport, and Destrehan Spur at Harvey. And the strange thing about it, all of those branch lines I just mentioned that was abandoned and taken up, I worked on every one of them, every one. Now, I worked the least on the DeRidder branch. I probably worked here maybe just 2 or 3 times. Let's see. And then finally, what happened, I guess, probably in the 1940s, that was the decline of steam engines, and the diesel, the more efficient diesel locomotives came into play. And so with that, something else, automobiles. Americans love their automobiles, and so they chose automobiles instead of the rails. So in 1986, the total number of rail miles in Louisiana stood at 3,000, less than 60% of what we had in 1915. I hope you've enjoyed this portion of my presentation about early railroads. Thank you.